What am I? Why do I exist? And what can I do? These are fundamental questions that we humans eventually have to ask ourselves, explicitly or implicitly. We find our own answers to these questions through the languages we speak, the books we read, the movies we watch. Asking these questions sculpts the form of our consciousness. Yet, no medium can illuminate these questions as beautifully and as succinctly as poetry. Poetry, as language qua language, presents to us an unadulterated essence which is to be enjoyed, analysed, but most importantly, felt. At the centre of Hamid Roslan's recently published collection of poems, Parstree Forest Fire, is the interaction and clashing of two languages, Singlish and English. Parstree Forest Fire is a 4-part collection in which Singlish and English poems occupy different sides of the book. Conventionally, such a book functions as a way for a person to learn a new language, but Roslan subverts our expectations by carving out his own unique style. As a poet, Roslan creates experiments within which we witness language being put to the test. Throughout the book, the idea of language is stretched to its limit, and sometimes beyond. Revelatory poetry as language is brought to a crisis. By loosely translating between Singlish and English, Roslan deftly explores what it means to interrogate ourselves with those fundamental questions. The book consists of 4 sections. The first is Parse. In Roslan's words, he is free to use language however he wants, no restrictions. The second section, Tree, explores what happens when language is decontextualized, an experience much like travelling to a different place, but the language you speak is not part of the environment. The third, Forest, is a reckoning of languages after they have been decontextualized. And the fourth, Fire, well.
And so in Fire, it gets a bit crazy now.
As we work our way through Roslan's alphabet soup, and the lines grow ever more incoherent, we begin to question if there is a point to all of this. We find our initially curious minds now going, what the fuck am I reading? Is there a meaning to all of this? But literary theory provides us with the lenses that can help us understand how to read Roslan's poetry. More importantly, it hands us the tools that serve to help us understand ourselves.
My interest in writing this book was not to figure out who my readers were, it was to tell my readers who they are. Like, I'm not looking for a readership. I think that when you read this collection, you find yourself where you know the languages that you know, and of the ones that you don't know, well, too bad.
The specificity of language is a key aspect of Parstree Forest Fire. There are readers who will not understand one language or the other, and as the author says, too bad lah. Since texts are unnecessarily communicative in nature, the question then arises, if half of the book is cordoned off via a language barrier, does Roslan's intent still remain intact? And if so, is it still relevant? By intentionally alienating a sizable proportion of his readership, Roslan is able to openly show the contradictions within and between Singlish and English. To understand how Roslan's work is an act of deconstruction, let us consider the act of translating a poem from Singlish to English. Because you must first understand the source, then transform it into a coherent target bound by the rules of the destination language, there is necessarily information lost in the form of contextual nuance. The aporia of this form of translation is clear. The very act of transferring information from one form to the other often results in twisted meanings. Roslan completely embraces this aporia, overhauling the act of translation in the process. He circumvents the apparent contradiction by throwing out the entire assumption that translations must reconstruct meaning as is at the destination language. In fact, his translations barely resemble the original lines. The first pair of poems, while seemingly about completely different subjects, seem to correspond in some abstract way. This correspondence is inscrutable, but we see it because we believe it exists. But then again, we can't really be sure, can we? With Roslan's deconstruction stripping away all our assumptions about how the pair of poems are to be read, we're kinda left with two bodies of text we suspect might have some form of relationship. In our heads, we're pitting one against the other, conjuring bases of correlation and comparison in the process. To be decolonial is to think critically and reflectively about how a people of a nation came to be. Ruslan brings to light the self-other dichotomy in his poetry by deconstructing the idea of translation, while also highlighting the cultural differences between the Singlish and English voices. Throughout the text, we encounter a confrontational, more aggressive Singlish voice. In contrast, the English counterpart across the page sounds abstract, educated, and even somewhat distanced. The personification of poetic voices in this manner draws our attention to the very real fact that English is often seen as the more sophisticated language. A language thus becomes more than a means of communicating via signs and symbols, but becomes a carrier of culture and its accompanying stereotypes. The snooty, colonial British tone of the English voice becomes an object of derision to the Singlish speaker who attempts to establish himself in the literary canon.
What is the next step? Like, can I, as a poet, try and find some way to embody myself in English, because English comes from a specific context? Can I put myself in there? Can I put myself in the language to say that this is, when I speak, that this is a reflection of who I am?
The later sections of the book see Ruslan struggle with decontextualizing the language he speaks and the language he thinks in. This represents a journey of self-discovery, where the once free poet becomes more and more restricted by his awareness of the self and the other. He forces himself into a burning forest of decontextualized language, and emerges with newfound knowledge about himself. The final section of the book then represents chaos, a stream of consciousness where language is no longer held to the rules set in place generations ago. As readers, we are spectators to his journey, and are more likely than not left in utter confusion.
Well, usually you think of self-expression as being this really articulate, like, wow, this person finally has their story told. But self-expression can also be something completely incoherent.
By showing us his journey, Ruslan prompts us to ponder what our own journey through language would look like. But he doesn't tell us how to go about doing so. Remember Ruslan's disregard for the reader. We are meant to carve out a path for ourselves, and in doing so, we might just understand ourselves better. In a similar vein, the great Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky wrote in his book, "Never try to convey your idea to the audience. It's a thankless and senseless task. Show them life, and they'll find within themselves the means to assess and appreciate it." Ruslan shares this sentiment, and as readers of his work, perhaps it's our imperative to become the subject that does the thinking, perpetuating the subject-object dichotomy. Without the author's firm grip to guide our thoughts along, we become hypersensitive to the frustrations and emotions that arise from reading Past Three Forest Fire. We are all entangled readers, and in order to cope with the unfamiliar and frightening space Ruslan has tossed us into, we begin a frantic but futile search for meaning. We're anxious because we need a grip over this arcane text, to understand every gimmick he throws at us, to say that we get it. But perhaps what Ruslan is trying to advocate for is a non-understanding in language, to loosen ourselves from the desire to find meaning in everything we consume, to be authentic about what we experience when reading something as insane and incoherent as Past Three Forest Fire. So, what are we reading? On the surface, it's a book of poetry and its translations, but at its core, Past Three Forest Fire is about the poet's journey through a landscape of deconstructed language. We are met with a deeply personal meditation that manages to bring to light issues of identity, language, and the intersection of the two via the lenses of deconstruction, decolonialism, and reader response theory. The text speaks, and it challenges us to listen. Whether or not we do so is entirely up to us.